Hey there, everyone. Welcome to my stream. No, this is we're gonna be reading Conroy's for Conroy's class, chapter 2. Y'all can see it on screen. And we're gonna read this. So chapter 2, and I checked Conroy's syllabus, and we should be good. Let me just pull that up real quick. There we go. Political parties. In class reading questions? No. Let's see. Okay, tomorrow is the 5th. So yeah. Mascot and Noel, chapter 2. Cool. We got this. All right. So, American political parties, a brief history. Looks like we got a picture of JFK here. Yeah, the photo in the book has JFK. Although the South is typically associated with the Republican Party in contemporary politics, it was once a stronghold for the Democratic Party. Here, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy campaigns in Texas with his running mate, Texas Senator Lyndon B. Johnson in 1960. Oh, I see Johnson right there. Wow, he's literally standing on top of the car. What is it called when it's not an omen, but whatever, sorry. Okay. Recently, conservative pundit Dinsha D'Souza has carved out an online niche for himself by seeking to portray the Democratic Party as the true home of racism, Nazism, and the Ku Klux Klan. He does not use a very selective examination of history, noting correctly that it was largely Democrats who led the secession movement that sparked the Civil War, and largely Democrats who opposed school integration and black voting rights in the 1950s and 60s, and that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. What D'Souza ignores, of course, is that the party identities have changed substantially in the past half century, and that Southern whites, once one of the most loyal Democratic voting blocs in the country, have become overwhelmingly Republican in recent decades. Political observers and historians like Kevin Cruz, wow, double K, have valiantly sought to correct the record, but D'Souza has yet to change his tune. As one commentator noted on Twitter, now called X, book is outdated, saying Lincoln was a Republican is like saying Nicolas Cage won an Oscar. Technically it's true, but a lot has happened since then. All this points to the importance of understanding the history of political parties. The United States has a two-party system for much of its existence, but those parties' identities, their membership, and their beliefs have changed substantially over the years. The ways the parties have shifted are instructive about many of the theoretical concepts outlined in Chapter 1. Whoops, did not read Chapter 1. A theme carried throughout the book is that the parties are an incredibly convenient tool for operating democracy because they help solve political problems. Political parties seem to appear almost anywhere people are trying to make collective decisions on behalf of the public. If you're a candidate running for office, it's helpful to have an organization that knows all the electoral rules and can locate and turn out sympathetic voters for you. If you're an elected legislator and you want to turn your idea into law, it's helpful to have a group of allies willing to provide their votes and their expertise so that your bill can survive multiple committees and floor votes. If you're a concerned citizen who wants to see changes in the way the country is run, it's useful to work with like-minded people who know how to influence elected officials. In all these situations, you can usually get far more done by working with others than going it alone. Helping people act collectively to achieve common goals is the essence of what political parties do. Yeah, that's for sure. we see the necessity for collective action in the emergence and development of political parties in the U.S. It is helpful to understand this history because it gives us an idea of just why the parties today take particular stances and consist of particular groups of people. Why are Democrats today the champions of civil rights, while Republicans are advocates for low taxation and minimal regulations of businesses? Why do Republicans tend to do better in sparsely populated, more rural areas of the country, while Democrats do better in more urbanized, densely populated areas? To answer these questions, we need to know about these parties' historical developments. In this chapter, we examine several pivotal moments in the development of American political parties, including the nation's founding, the critical election of 1800. Is that the populist one with, well, whatever, we'll get there. The party collapse prior to the Civil War, the response to the Great Depression, and the Civil Rights Movement. We also seek to explain these pivotal movements as part of party realignments, quote unquote, a term we'll examine later. These key moments help to reveal how parties are born, how they steer governing agendas, and how they select nominees, and how their coalitions shift over time. End notes. Okay. All right. Next, not chapter, but next section. Constructing parties for a new government. As we noted in chapter 1, the U.S. Constitution contains no mention of political parties, and the founders were eloquently about the need to build a government without them. Nevertheless, just after a few years under the Constitution, those same people who thought parties were a bad idea began to form parties. What began as a faction in George Washington's cabinet and congressional alliances surrounding Jefferson and Hamilton, oh, here we go, Alexander Hamilton, you know, Aaron Burr. Hamilton soon became known as, respectively, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalist. I think Hamilton was a Federalist. Sorry, I got mocos. All right, those familiar with the musical Hamilton, too familiar. I'm so done with Lin-Manuel Miranda. So done with him. Will recognize how these early parties were driven strongly by personality differences. Hamilton and Jefferson despised each other from their first meeting. Oh yeah, that's right. Why does Hamilton have to beef with so many people? What is he, me? Sorry. And identity claims in the musical, Jefferson derided Hamilton for his citified perspective, for smelling like new money and dressing like fake royalty. Oh my God, I can't believe they're trying to explain this musical, this queer-ass musical. Hamilton hated Jefferson's pretensions as a farmer when he was in fact a wealthy slave owner. Keep ranting. We know why is there Lin-Manuel Miranda quotes in this book? Keep ranting. We know who's doing the planting. Oh my God. But those differences also reinforce divergent views about the best direction for the new country. Hamilton and his allies sought to build up the national government's ability to tax and regulate the economy, while Jefferson's group wanted a relatively weak national government but stronger state governments. Oh, states' rights, of course, coming from the slave owner. Each side worked not just to maintain party discipline in Congress, but also to foster relationships with local notables, journalists, and pamphleteers. God. Pamphleteers. I'm just assuming these are people that make their own signs, you know? In an effort to get the message out and elect more people supportive of their goals. Okay, here we got a picture of the oldies, of the OGs, the factions that formed George Washington's first cabinet around Alexander Hamilton in the center, and Thomas Jefferson to Hamilton's right. No, you mean to Hamilton's left. The book is wrong. Evolved into the first political parties. Okay. All right, back to the chapter 2. The need to win the presidency in particular spurred two specific organizational movements. When Jefferson lost the election of 1796 to John Adams, he and his supporters vowed to win a rematch, okay? They identified New York as the potential swing state. Electors from New York were at the time chosen by the state legislature. So the Jeffersonians' first move was to organize a party to win legislators in New York. The framed Tammany Hall political organization, see Chapter 6, not yet, buddy, began in part from efforts by Aaron Burr. There he goes again. Aaron Burr is Alexander Hamilton's like sworn enemy for whatever reason. Efforts by Aaron Burr to organize in New York with an eye towards 1800. In 1800, Jefferson faced Adams again. This time, Jefferson won, in large part due to the switch of New York's 12 electoral votes from the Federalist to the Democratic Republican column. But it wasn't enough just to win more electors. The Constitution had not envisioned parties, and so it was set up to accommodate those divisions. Oh, it wasn't set up to accommodate those divisions. Oh, that's why we got the presidential. Is that why we used to have the president be elected from one party and then second place would be vice president and they're not part of the same party? All right. Notably, the original Constitution called for the candidate who came in second. Oh, I just answered my own question. Wow, I'm so smart. Originally, the institution called for the candidate who came in second in the Electoral College vote to become the vice president. Each elector had 2 votes, and the framers imagined they'd choose the 2 most qualified candidates without regard for political party. Boy, were they wrong. But if the 2 leading candidates represented different partisan groups, this all but guaranteed that the vice president would be from a different party than the president. After coming in second in 1796, Jefferson had spent 4 years as vice president to an Adams administration that he disliked and disagreed with. Imagine if it was Trump was the president and then Kamala Harris was his vice president. That would be wild. That would be the worst. He would try to fire her immediately. Okay, sorry. Neither party was happy with that outcome, so they separately devised a strategy to select both the president and vice president from their own party. Each party ran a ticket with a candidate for each office. The Democratic Republicans ran Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr, there we go, for vice president. The Federalists ran a ticket of John Adams and Charles Pinckney. Since each elector had 2 votes, each party arranged for its elector to give 1 less vote for their vice presidential candidate. And if all the electors voted according to plan, the winning party's candidate would win both positions. That move required a bit of coordination. In the early years of the Republic, electors were not bound to vote for their party's candidates. In 1796, for instance, many electors were extremely idiosyncratic, especially with their second vote. In 1800, there was only one mistake in which the elector who was supposed to not vote for Burr actually did, and Jefferson and Burr tied. The Federalists followed through on the plan, with each one elector voting for John Jay, but all 73 of the Democratic Republican electors voted for both Jefferson and Burr. The tie was resolved in the House of Representatives, which despite being still controlled by the Federalists, ended up narrowly choosing Jefferson as president. Wow. In other words, the parties organized a response to the requirements of the political system. National geography, the rules of the Constitution, how each state had adopted to those rules, they all created obstacles and opportunities for parties to organize for victory. For this reason, we sometimes say that parties are endogenous institutions. Endogenous just means that something has its cause or origin within the system. Parties adapt to the system they are in. When possible, they adjust to the system itself. In this case, the 12th Amendment adjusted the presidential election system to accommodate party tickets without any coordination. All right. Proto-party. All right, next section of chapter 2, proto-parties in early Congress. The preceding example shows how parties may be endogenous to electoral rules. They formed as a way of enabling coordination across different states as factions sought to control the presidency. We also can see parties as endogenous to legislative institutions. The first Congress convened in March of 1789 in New York City, and by most accounts, voting patterns were somewhat chaotic. Legislative parties were not well organized at that point, and members who voted together on one important issue were likely to oppose each other on the next one. As historian James Young founded in his study of the early Congress, members often voted by region or even by residence. Members often lived in small dormitories with few colleagues in the early years, or with a few colleagues, rather than by party. Interesting. This changed over time, however. Increasingly, members began voting by party. As we discussed in the previous chapter, there are good reasons for voting this way. Putting together a winning roll call vote on each and every bill one cares about is basically impossible, but it's easier to win more often if one member of a long coalition united across a wide range of issues. It means that if you lose, it means that you will lose when your party is in the minority, but you will have a good chance at getting your bills passed when your party is in the majority, which allows you to claim credit with your constituents when you tell them about all the work you've gotten done on their behalf. Yeah. As party line voting grew during the 1790s, Jefferson's Democratic Republicans found themselves increasingly on the losing side of congressional roll call votes, with Hamilton's Federalists proving to be more organized and better able to secure election victories. Jefferson and his allies reasoned that the solution to their problems lay in increasing their numbers in the Congress. The election of 1800 involved not only a critical presidential election, but also sophisticated interstate efforts to coordinate messaging and strategies. The Democratic Republicans routed the Federalists in 1800, increasing their share of a 106-member House from 48 to 68 members, while seizing a narrow majority in the Senate. Federalists have been the dominant party in the 1790s. After 1800, they would never control either congressional chamber again. It would be too simple to suggest that the Federalist and Democratic Republicans emerged completely within the Congress. They were, after all, championing ideas about economic policies, federal government power, and other issues that predicated the birth of the United States and were alive well outside of legislators. But these early parties also developed in a way that allowed members of Congress to best capitalize on their capacities for generating ideas, turning out voters and organizing roll call votes. All right. Next section, the era of good feelings. In the 1820s, parties became more innovative in how they organized elections. By then, the Federalists had almost completely disbanded, and most American politicians identified with the Democratic-Republican Party, most American politicians identified with the Democratic-Republican Party of Jefferson. This was the era of quote-unquote good feelings, so named because there were essentially no partisan divisions in Washington. But that didn't mean there were no differences in opinion or conflicting ambitions. In 1824, the Democratic Republicans' big tent started to get crowded, and 4 credible Democratic Republican candidates ran for president. Secretary of State and son of founder John Quincy Adams, U.S. House Speaker Henry Clay, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Crawford, and U.S. Senator and former U.S. Army General Andrew Jackson. That's right, the guy in the 20. Okay. So here's a table. Election of 1824. Andrew Jackson got 41% of the popular vote. John Quincy Adams got 31%. Henry Clay got 13%. The Electoral College, Andrew Jackson got 99 votes. John Quincy got 84. Henry Clay got 37. So it was Andrew Jackson that won. Oh, and here's William Crawford on the next page. He's even more pathetic than Henry Clay. As we can see, the most popular candidate was Andrew Jackson, but the Constitution requires an outright majority in the Electoral College, and 99 out of 261 is about 38%. Oh, that's not a majority. When no one wins a majority, it becomes the House of Representatives' obligation to choose from among the top 3 choices. In the House, each state gets 1 vote. The House considered Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. Clay didn't make the cut. Even though Jackson won the most votes, Adams prevailed in the House. That's crazy. His victory came in part from support from oh my God, I almost said Hillary Clinton, from Henry Clay, who urged his backers to vote for Adams. Some accused Clay of backing Adams in exchange for being appointed Secretary of State. Oof, of course, backdoor deals. Adams did not appoint Clay, but there's a simpler explanation. Clay and Clay's supporters liked Adams much more than they liked Jackson. While all 4 candidates were Democratic Republicans, they represented slightly different visions. Clay and Adams were more similar to the now defunct Federalist. Crawford and Jackson were now more similar to the original Jeffersonians. This threw the young political system into something of a crisis. The popular vote winner had been denied the election, and there were allegations of corruption in the selection of the new president. Of course, the parties were learning an important lesson here about the failure of coordination. What if each of those 2 factions had run only 1 candidate? There's no way to know the answer to that question for sure, but we do know that Jackson's backers, who felt unjustly denied by the vote in the House, set out to make sure their votes weren't split again. With leadership from Martin Van Buren, Jacksonians organized a convention to nominate Jackson again in 1828. What's more, the Democrats, as they now called themselves, mobilized voters across the country. Voter turnout more than doubled between 1824 and 1828. That's crazy. That's only 4 years, jumping from 26 to 56%. Jackson defeated President Adams with 56% of the popular vote and 68% of the Electoral College. Jackson's loss and redemption illustrates the power of coordination. The population of eligible voters didn't change wildly between 1824 and 1828, and the 2 major choices didn't change either. But the efforts of the Democratic Party changed the outcome. By coordinating across different potential candidates and agreeing on a nominee, Jackson and his backers reshaped the options the voters had. By encouraging turnout, they changed who the voters were. These events were a stunning testament to the power of a party to affect political outcomes, even if they weren't changing many minds. Okay. Next section of Chapter 2, Agenda Control. With Jackson's Democrats in control of the White House and of the Congress at the close of 1820, they began to work of undoing federal regulation of the economy and dismantling the national bank, which had been central to Adams' policies. Meanwhile, a new party, the Whigs, was trying to limit the power of President Jackson and promote the authority of Congress. At this point, the parties had fairly coherent economic positions, and they had a clear view of the various unorthodox powers Jackson claimed as president. Internally, however, the parties were divided on the critical issue of slavery. Each party had strength in both northern and southern states, and thus each party found the subject of slavery an uncomfortable one. Taking a position would inevitably divide the party. As we noted in the previous chapter, political parties is a long coalition. Each member commits to vote for their policies that the other member care about in exchange for support for their own issues. This exchange is easiest when your party is asking you to vote for something you and your constituents don't care one way or another. But when you and your co-partisans care deeply about opposite sides of the same issue, the only solution may be to avoid the issue altogether. Doesn't that sound like Democrats and Palestine? I don't know. That's just my spicy take. Let me know what you think. As the nation grew westward, both Democrats and Whigs found it hard to avoid the topic of slavery. Pro-slavery politicians sought to add new slave states to the nation, while anti-slavery leaders sought to contain or eliminate the institution, sometimes seeking to add free states to counter the representation by the new slave states. Much of Congress's activities between 1820 and 1850 can be seen as an effort to keep the issue of slavery from dominating the national discussion. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 set a northern boundary for slavery and set a guideline for admitting equal number of slave and free states so neither side would dominate Congress. A number of decisions, collectively known as the Compromise of 1850, sought an equitable use of the Southwest Territories, one in their recent war with Mexico, admitting California as a free state and ending the slave trade in the District of Columbia, but also establishing a federal fugitive slave law. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was an attempt to diffuse slavery tensions in the Kansas Territory by dividing it into two new states that could decide among themselves whether to be slave or free. These legislative actions were all efforts to keep the divisive slavery issue from dominating congressional deliberations and dividing the parties internally. Yet the parties were evolving in how they discussed slavery. At the time of the nation's founding, many leaders, including Jefferson, Washington, Madison, and others, recognized that they were economically bound to slavery and thus protected it politically. But they were also clearly uncomfortable with the institution, saw it as potentially catastrophic for the nation, and rarely publicly defended it. By the 1850s, however, prominent Southern Democrats have emerged as fierce defenders of slavery had developed an entire ideology to support the idea of human bondage as an inherent good. Meanwhile, sectional or geographic tensions continued to escalate, with increasing violence between pro- and anti-slavery factions in the Kansas Territory, massive public pushback to the Supreme Court's defense of the Fugitive Slave Act, and increasingly anti-slavery activism by formerly enslaved people and abolitionists, like John Brown, I'm sure. By the mid-1950s, Democrats in the North began to abandon their party, while the Whigs straddled across pro- and anti-slavery portions of the country and, desperate to avoid discussing the issue, collapsed as a party. From their northern ashes, an anti-slavery coalition calling itself the Republican Party emerged in 1854. The multi-decade bipartisan effort to keep slavery off the national agenda had ultimately failed. Slavery was now the dominant issue moving national politics. The 1860 election remains the starkest example of sectional polarization we've seen. Democratic support for the party's nominees was confined largely to southern slave states, and the Republican nominee, Abraham Lincoln, was not even on the ballot in much of that region, although Democrats remained a potent political force in some northern cities like New York and Boston. Republicans dominated the Union states. The Civil War can be seen as almost as much of a battle between the parties as it is between the states. Oh crap, that's right. Because I mean, if the Republican Party was basically founded by abolitionists, then yeah, I get it. The Union victory and subsequent extension of voting rights enfranchisement to many formerly enslaved people in the South during Reconstruction allowed Republicans to dominate national politics in the decades following the Civil War. The withdrawal over federal government forces from the South following the 1876 election, however, along with Jim Crow laws and the rise of the KKK, suppressed African American votes throughout the former Confederacy. Confederacy, enabling the Democratic Party to return to prominence there. Even though Republicans mostly controlled the White House and Congress through the late 19th century, the Democratic resurgence in the South in many Western states would end up making the party system more competitive at a national level. All right, next section, candidate selection. One of the most important decisions of a party makes its selection of nominees for high office. As politicians learned in the election of 1824, failing to coordinate and decide on a candidate can be dangerous for a party or a faction of a party. In subsequent elections, parties worked hard to make sure that their members were united behind a single candidate who could adequately represent most of the factions within the party. But these efforts sometimes failed. By the 1800s, a popular political reform movement had spread amongst farming communities in the West and South. Largely an agrarian protest movement in Western and Southern states, it advocated for farmers, wage workers, and others concerned about massive technological changes and the concentration of wealth and corporate power. Damn, this sounds like a working class revolution. This movement would soon call itself the Populist Party or the People's Party. Hell yeah. And it fielded a candidate for president and other offices in 1892. Its platform urged a host of reforms designed to ease the plight of impoverished farmers and also to make politics more open and accessible. That is, seeking to minimize corruption and open up politics to outsiders. The Populist Party was the original populist movement in that it framed itself as defending the interest of the common people above those of businesses and government elites. Sounds like my kind of party. Other populist movements may involve different issues and defining the people and elites differently, but their core feature is this farming of conflict between the people and the elites. Sounds like the same issues we're having today. The Populist Party's success caught political observers by surprise. Its nominee, U.S. Representative James Weaver of Iowa, claimed 8.5% of the popular presidential vote, along with 22 electoral college votes. The results suggested that though the populists were not able to win the presidency, they had enough power to deprive one of the major parties of a victory. The election results also suggested to the major parties that there was a significant benefit to winning over supporters who had voted with the Populist Party. Just like today, still a significant benefit. Over the course of the next few years, the Democratic Party would come to embrace many of the populist platform's economic planks, if not always the ones based on political reform. In 1896, both the Democratic and the Populist parties nominated Nebraskan William Jennings Bryan for president, essentially fusing the parties. The gamble didn't pay off, however. Bryan lost to Republican William McKinley. The Populists were devastated and their party collapsed. What remained, however, was a transformed Democratic Party. Damn, 1896, so that's like right before the turn of the century. The results of the 1896 election revealed new sectional division to the country, with Southern whites and Western state farmers forming the Democratic coalition and Republicans representing the industrializing and populous Northeast and Midwest. Republicans typically controlled the White House and Congress during this period. Although that control was sometimes undermined by factional splits, some remnants of the populist movement would form the progressive movement of the early 20th century. That's right, progressives came after. This new movement consisted largely of Republicans seeking to reform the government, industry, and journalism. Damn, I didn't know about that. The progressives would constitute an important faction within the Republican Party of the early 1900s. A rift between progressive and sandpat, more traditional Republicans. Oh, sandpatters. That's all they do. They don't actually build castles or anything. They just pat the sand, right? Is that what the sand patters are? Theodore Roosevelt served as a Republican president between 1901 and 1909, mostly aligning himself with issues associated with progressivism, including reform of politics and regulation of industries. Though Roosevelt declined to run for re-election in 1908, he re-entered politics in 1912 as a bull moose progressive presidential candidate, challenging both the Republican incumbent William Howard Taft and his Democratic challenger Woodrow Wilson. With the Republican coalition functionally split between its progressive and sandpat factions, the Democrats took the White House with less than a majority of the vote. See Chapter 9. We'll go to Chapter 9 when it's time to go to Chapter 9. All right, next section of Chapter 2, coalitions and crises. As we've seen, party coalitions may shift a bit from year to year, but overall they tend to be quite durable, only falling apart during major national crises like the Civil War. Another such crisis occurred in the late 1920s and 1930s. I wonder what that could be. With the collapse of the stock market and the onset of the Great Depression. As the party in control of the national government, Republicans were broadly blamed for massive unemployment, economic contraction, and destruction of wealth, which helped Democrats take over the presidency and large majorities of Congress and state legislators in the 1932 election. Many scholars identified this voting shift as realignment. The new party system would define the politics of next several decades, with Democrats broadly advancing greater regulation over the economy and expanding the social welfare state, and Republicans largely resisting such moves in the name of free enterprise. Social Security in 1935, Medicare in 1965, and Medicaid in 1965 all emerged during this period, despite the sharp issue divisions of the 1930s. Much of this era would be defined by parties with only vague ideological distinctions. Southern whites, still culturally opposed to the party of Lincoln, would be among the Democratic Party's most staunch supporters, while Northern laborers embraced Democrats due to their record during the Depression. Each major party contained large cohorts of liberals and conservatives. Though the party period of 1920 and 1930 was largely defined by economic matters, race became a key issue as civil rights activists and union members pressed for changes in the mid-20th century, in particular through the constitutional amendments passed after the Civil War extending full citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Those rights had been systematically undermined by state and local governments, especially in the South, for almost a full century thereafter. Many white leaders in the majority Democrat Party of the period sought to ignore or downplay this issue as it threatened to undermine their vast coalition of urban laborers in the North and poorer whites in the South. Yet, as we saw in the mid-1800s, the issue could only be ignored for so long, with civil rights activists and pro-civil rights union leaders increasing their power in the beginning to influence party nomination processes. And with African Americans migrating to the rural South, from the rural South to urban centers in the North, the Great Migration, and becoming more democratic in their voting behaviors, Democratic leaders ultimately backed their causes, resulting in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Democratic President Lyndon Johnson crowded these substantial policy victories, but allegedly expressed concerns to his staff that he had just delivered the South to the Republican Party. Over the next few decades, white Southerners would increasingly see the Democratic Party as hostile to their culture and interests, and would come to embrace the Republican Party. This shift had profound consequences on American politics and is key for understanding modern American parties and polarization. Many observers of modern American politics find it striking that Southern states, one of the strongest regions of support for the Republican Party, was solidly Democrat in the mid-20th century, and even a relatively unsuccessful national Democratic candidate like Adlai Clay Stevenson, I don't even know that person, the Democratic presidential nominee in 1952 and 56, that's like even before my parents' times, could count on the support of the South as long as he didn't mention civil rights too often. In the second half of the 20th century, the most conservative voters in the nation, Southern whites, shifted their support from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Meanwhile, newly enfranchised and generally liberal African American began voting in large percentages for Democrats. Over the course of a century, the parties had essentially switched places on the politics of race. The Republicans of 1850 throughout 1870s were deeply committed to ending slavery and advancing the rights of formerly enslaved people. By the 1950s through the 70s, it was the Democratic Party that had taken up the cause of civil rights. These trends, brought by party alignment in sync with the ideological alignment, make the Democratic Party more liberal and the Republican Party more conservative, which in turn contributed to the Democratic Party contributed to the dramatic party polarization we've seen since the late 1980s. The parties today have their regional strengths, but at the national level, they're about as competitive as they've ever been. In recent decades, control of the presidency and Congress has been consistently up for grabs in a way that it has never been previously. Okay, and then here's a map. Okay, hopefully this is the last section. Political Science Toolkit, Realignment. Throughout this book, we describe parties and coalitions. A party is made up of many groups, some of which you may disagree with one or another. Many episodes... Oh, is this still a book? Is this still... Yes, it is, isn't it? Okay, hold on. Okay, we're almost done. I promise. We are almost done. Okay. Ways that the party actors have tried to hold these groups together, but the groups that make up a party may sometimes split apart, with one eventually joining the other party. Groups of voters also sometimes cease to be relevant at all, and new groups replace them. Such changes in the composition of parties are called realignments. Realignment is a term that gets thrown around a bit during election coverage and is often used incorrectly. A realignment is not one party doing unexpectedly well in an election or taking control of all branches of government. Realignment is a change in who's in the party. Recall the long coalition framework we introduced in the last chapter. Okay, you can look at that graph. We argued that in a small 3-person legislature where everyone wants slightly different things, 2 legislators will have incentive to get together and support each other's policy goals. That would be the bias for a political party. But in a simple example we put together, any 2 legislators could want to form such party. So A and B, or B and C, or A and C are all possible parties. A realignment is when one coalition member moves from one coalition to another. If B leaves the party of A and B and joins a new party with C becoming B and C, that's realignment. Political parties aren't made up of only 2 legislators, but the dynamics of party coalitions can be illustrated in this way. Perhaps the most significant realignment in American history has been the shift of segregationist Southerners from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in the mid-20th century. That's crazy. They were like, oh my God, Black people are coming and voting for Democrats. We have to switch parties right now. I cannot be associated with these Black people in my party. That's crazy that segregationists did that. They did white flight, but instead of like leaving an urban area, they just went to another party. A simplified version of these groups in the following table. In this case, we have replaced the numbers of the table with general assessments of whether the policy is good or bad for a group in question. We show 3 groups that were part of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party in this period was also a coalition of different groups, but their divisions are not important for this example. Okay, coalition building in the 20th century. Oh, we got laborers, segregationists, Black people, and then Republican business owners. and then how they stand on the policies. Interesting. All right. In the late 1930s, the New Deal coalition of the Democratic Party included both labor unions and segregationists. Many black voters were also now voting for Democrats. Despite the Democratic Party's history of supporting slavery and opposing civil rights, black voters often benefited enough from the New Deal labor policies to justify supporting Democrats, especially in the North and for president. The Democratic coalition was held together by a log roll between the first two large groups. Southern segregationists agreed to support labor laws, even though many Southern conservatives were not very excited about them, in exchange for a commitment from Northern Party leaders not to push on civil rights. The kind of tactic log roll seen between Northern labor and Southern segregationist is common in coalitions. But as we have seen with the Whig and the Democratic Party trying to avoid the issue of slavery, holding off on division is not easy. When the political system attempts to avoid the issue that matters to its citizens, someone will find a way to get the issue into the political landscape. Sounds like abortion. Banning abortion. In the case of civil rights, liberal activists in the early 20th century were frustrated for decades by their inability to advance civil rights. Legislation, voting protection, anti-lynching laws, and so forth in the Congress, thanks to the log roll within the Democratic Party between segregationists and labor advocates, those pro-civil rights activists saw new ways to press the issue both inside and outside the Democratic Party. The subject became harder for the party to avoid, as many important black politicians were winning power within the Democratic Party. In Chapter 3, we will discuss New York Representative Adam Clayton Powell's strategy for forcing Congress to vote on civil rights. In addition, the political scientist Kenesha Grant shows in her book The Great Migration newly empowered black politicians representing the communities that had moved to northern cities in the Great Migration pressed for these issues. And even in the communities where African American populations was small, northern liberal Democrats began to pay more attention to civil rights. Civil rights played a dominant role in the 1948 Democratic National Convention. That year, incumbent Harry S. Truman was nominated to campaign for his first full term, having taken over the presidency after FDR died. Northern liberal Democrats pressed for strong pro-civil rights platform plank. Campaign strategist Clark Clifford argued that support from the new black votes in the northern cities would be critical to winning elections. Southern Democrats were outraged over the new platform, but they lost the fight. In response, 35 Southern Democrats from Mississippi and Alabama walked out of the convention. Man, stay pressed. These angry Southerners did not immediately join the Republican Party. They had too many ties to the Democrats. They eventually formed the States' Rights Democratic Party, which nominated Southern Carolina Senator Storm Thurmond. Isn't that the guy? Isn't he like super racist? Or is that Strong Thurmond? I don't know. Storm Thurmond for president. They wanted to prevent the Democratic Party from further embracing civil rights and had it return to its earlier position on the issue. But the Southern, racially conservative part of the coalition repeatedly lost in conflicts with the Northern, racially liberal part, driving this group into the Republican Party. The Republicans, for their part, welcomed new voters. The party had a long-standing disadvantage in party identification and held majorities in Congress only twice since Hoover had been president, 1929 to 33. Just as Democrats had seen promise in pursuing black votes in the North, Republicans saw an opportunity with white conservative voters in the South. In what has been termed as the Southern strategy, presidential candidate Barry Goldwater in 1964 and Richard Nixon in 1968 successfully pursued these votes. successfully pursued these voters. Before Goldwater, no Republican had won widely in the South since Reconstruction. In a blowout loss to Lyndon Johnson, Goldwater won only 5 states: Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, in addition to his home state of Arizona. Today, these southern states are the most reliable parts of the Republican coalition. This nearly complete reversal of the South in less than a decade is shown in Figure 2.2. In terms of our coalitions model, then, Southern racial conservatives were a core part of the Democratic coalition before 1948. And 2 decades later, they had begun a steady migration into the Republican Party. Over the past half century, the issues that are relevant to Black voters, racial liberals, and conservatives more broadly have changed, but those who advocated for policies aimed at helping racial minorities have moved into the Democratic Party, while those who oppose many of those policies have moved from the Democrats into the Republican Party. Politics generally, and party coalitions more specifically, are always shifting in subtle ways. And sometimes a party will simply have a good election year thanks to a strong economy or a war or a clever campaign or something else. In those years, we'll see support from certain groups shift somewhat, but largely in the same direction. In 2008, for example, Democrat Barack Obama managed to win a majority of voters making over $200,000 per year, a constituency that has usually voted solidly for Republican presidential candidates. That's crazy. Making $200,000 in like 2008 is like what? Making over like $300K a year? That's crazy. But this didn't mark realignment. It was rather a reflection of economic collapse in 2008 that hit people in that income category unusually hard and turned them against the incumbent party. Wealthy voters returned to their previous voting patterns by 2012. Shout out to the Mormon candidate. When you're watching or reading about a recent election and a pundit says something about realignment, you should be skeptical. Then ask yourself, or the pundit, has there been a shift? Did that group that's been voting with one party for a long time suddenly start voting with another party? Did some of the new issues disrupt the old arrangement between the parties? Did politics suddenly get a lot less predictable? If so, then you might just be witnessing a realignment. And that's the end of chapter 2. We're not going to go over the glossary. We're not going to go over the end notes. All right. Oh, no. Is that the end of chapter 2? Oh. Okay. Yeah, I think that's the end of chapter 2, because here, oh no, chapter 3 looks real interesting. No, Obamacare. We're going to talk about the Tea Party in chapter 3. Oh man, that's going to be great. All right. Thank you for watching.